All right, we're going to talk about D&D, as we do. But this time I want to talk about something a little weird. I want to talk about the idea of D&D as art. Not the art of D&D, not like the mastery of being a DM. Not art from D&D, the literal manifestations, creative manifestations of like characters and worlds and places and events, which are all awesome. But the actual idea that D&D, participating in a game of D&D, is art. That process, the game happening in and of itself, is art in some form. And I want to put a caveat up front because I've tried to record this a couple times and I feel myself stumbling over this idea, and I don't want to make this commentary, at least not in this video. I'm going to be specifically talking about like home games, specifically you and your friends around a table, virtual or otherwise, physical or otherwise, playing this game. And I'm not talking about D&D as an entertainment product. I'm not talking about professional D&D games that you may or may not watch. I think that's a different conversation. I think you can have a conversation about the different degrees of authenticity of D&D in those scenarios and if they can be maintained. But that's not this. This might ultimately feel like a preface for that discussion, but that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm specifically talking about you, your nerdy friends sitting around a table, being nerds, playing D&D, and thinking of that activity, the actual doing of that as being art. Okay, cool. Now with that preface out of the way, there's like a through line that I think is going to bring all this together. I think I'll leave that to the end. And we're just going to kind of break it down to these three other ideas and then like wrap it in a bow with this through line that kind of is what makes D&D so novel as compared to other things. So you have this idea initially here. The first thing I want to talk about is that D&D, the activity of D&D, is something you do for its own sake. There are not a lot of things in your life that are like this. There are not a lot of things you partake in or do that you do purely for their own sake. Oftentimes, you have some other goal that you want by participating in certain activities. Work, say, for as an easy example, it might be working to procure money so that you can do other things you're interested in, for example, or, sustain yourself. Whereas D&D is this interesting activity that you engage in purely for the sake of engaging in it. You're playing the game to play the game. And obviously you can make an interesting observation here about, well, are you just doing fun? Like, is the pure idea of playing D&D fun? And I think you could like have an interesting conversation there, but I will contend I'm going to work with the subjective assumption that there is more to it than that D&D is like, fun isn't the right word necessarily. D&D is stimulating in a way that is different than just enjoying yourself. Obviously, it's better to have games that are fun, the rule of fun, for example, but ultimately there are moments in D&D that are not enjoyable, or at least the fact that you're experiencing emotions other than joy is possible and favorable, and that those moments are just as good, using that word fairly broadly. If not having them is actually bad, is maybe the better way of putting it. Like, your game is better for having those moments. So in that way, you're being brought into something that at face value is maybe not obvious why it would be innately attractive to other people. Like, why would you opt to do something where one of the outcomes is that you might be sad or angry? And that's what I think is like interesting, or kind of like gives this idea of innate artistic integrity to the playing of the game, where you're opting into something where you're unsure of how it will make you feel, but what you're there to do is feel something. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in one of these other kind of like, call them buckets I'm putting stuff into. So that was kind of the first bucket, this idea that you play D&D for its own sake. The second one is that there's this fairly novel asymmetry to tabletop games like D&D, where the product, I guess you could say, of playing the game is this, or the byproduct maybe is a better way of putting it, of playing the game is this fictional experiential narrative. You're like creating in real time a story that is had and experienced and then is over and is done. And again, let's set aside the idea of people who record or tape their games. I'm not talking about those. The fact that you kind of have this system produces this interesting situation where you are making something. You have an individual who is essentially guiding this process and then pushing it to and fro asymmetrically, and the individuals who are not the DM are just ebbing and flowing at the whim of one other person, and they have, again, voluntarily put themselves in the situation where they're passing the authority of this fictional world onto another individual and reacting, engaging, and mutating this world to their own will, but at the ultimate whim of one other person. Or I guess it could be multiple other people, but usually one other person. And you end up with like the byproduct of this experiential narrative, this story that happens in real time, is this intangible thing that you're there to have, you're there to be an experiencer of, and once it's been experienced, it's over, and all you can do is come back and have a new one. It's fleeting and ephemeral, and is there only to be experienced in those moments, and then to be remembered and evoke emotions later, potentially, but ultimately was there for that one specific moment and no other. And there's something about that. And that one's like a little less tangible to me, even as I kind of like talk my way through this. I'm not exactly sure why that makes me feel like it's art, but I think the fact that it evokes very specific, interesting emotions, just even thinking about that is kind of the truth of the game, gives it, again, an artistic integrity that I don't know how else I would contain it. And if you have feelings about that, please, by all means, talk about it in the comments. I would love to think my way more through this. Okay, the third one, and I think I've tipped my hat on this one, is the fact that the game is inherently evocative. And let's depack that term. I don't mean in the political ways, which is how it's often used. I mean that it just simply makes you feel things. It evokes emotions in you, and it does it more so than most any other medium that I have personally engaged in. And I think there's probably something to be said that there's like a predisposition. People have a predisposition to have emotions evoked in this way, are more likely to be drawn to D&D than people who don't. Maybe it's possible that literally anyone can, and it's just degrees. But again, I don't know how I feel about that. But it's just a walk my way through an intuition there. But that being said, at the end of the day, you sit down at a table, again, virtual or otherwise, and you feel things and are made to feel things or elect to feel things, depending kind of sort of on the situation. If you're in a situation your DM is being very explicit and descriptive about that you do not have a lot of control, you might say that's being made to feel something, whereas electing to feel something is kind of the emergent emotion you might have in a situation where you have decided your character has a certain feeling, and you are so invested or immersed that you yourself are pulled into having those feelings. That is truly novel, and I don't think it's necessarily unique to D&D. I feel like it's unique to tabletop games, maybe, or like tabletop-like experiences. But the fact that you are there to have those feelings, that like the reason, some of the reason we play D&D, some of the most compelling parts of the game is just around the idea that it does evoke things, that it makes you feel things other than joy. Although I would contend that joy is generally the preferable emotion for most of the game, but as I kind of said earlier, it is not the end all and be all. In fact, the game is often amplified by the evocation of other emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, confliction, etc. And I think, again, that there's something inherently authentic about engaging in D&D for the purpose of having your emotions messed with, or in the case of the DM, sometimes messing with people's emotions. In that way, you can say that there is a real-time artistic expression happening in those moments, that you are creating art in real time and seeing what's happening in real time. And that kind of brings me to the through line. Okay, so this fourth idea. Okay, the fourth idea is the dynamicism about D&D that really separates it as like this novel art form in my mind. So we have this idea of it being done for its own sake, and the idea of producing a experiential fictional narrative at the table, and that narrative, that you're there for its own sake, evokes these emotions, is an evocative pursuit. But what really kind of ties all that together is the dynamicism. The fact that all of this is happening in real time, and that you, as the DM and players, are molding it and shaping it. If this ephemeral thing is being tapered and broadened as seen fit by the moment, by instinct, by your desire and impulse, and almost nothing else. There's very little that's feeding into that other than your own emotional intuition, your own experiential hedonism. You're just there to do the thing. You're just doing the thing, and that is producing and changing this world that you're in, this thing that you have made and are continuing to make. And it's that dynamicism that I feel like fundamentally is what makes D&D art. It's bringing those three ideas together, and then like the fact that it's a living, breathing, ephemeral thing that once it's happened and has kind of been it becomes almost historic, and is just an artifact in your minds of something that you've all done together, and that is it. And the only reason it was done was because you all wanted it to happen, and it did. And there's something truly, there's like an intangible like beauty in that I think is hard to truly capture in words. I feel like I'm not necessarily doing it service, but that idea is like fundamentally what makes me feel like D&D is art. Walking away from the table and knowing everyone at the table felt something, yourself included as the DM. Like, I don't know what else. If art is not that, I don't know what art is. Yeah, so I think we're gonna end it there. If this made you feel things, maybe this video is art. But please let me know your thoughts, ideas, comments down below. I would really enjoy hearing from other people about this. I want to give kudos to my buddy Zach, and Weston actually, who talked to me about kind of an unrelated idea, but ultimately sort of inspired me to think about this. Anyways, thanks guys. Subscribe if you want more of this stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.